But there is something to be said about the rising authoritarianism, the expansion of a security state, the use of particular types of weaponry that we see both in Israel and the United States that speaks to a global system that we have to dismantle.
So such a switcheroo produces the economic room for agricultural practices that along the way bring a better sense of well-being, control animal diseases that have been shown to go pandemic, and produce landscapes adapted to climate change.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Maine to New York City and points west. Today, Palestine, Israel, Burma, India, and climate change. We begin with talks by Omar Barghouti and Marc Lamont Hill at a Zoom panel on BDS sponsored by the Democratic Socialists of America Palestine Solidarity Group.
My name is Olivia Catby-Smith. I'm the co-chair of the Portland chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America and a member of DSA's National BDS and Palestine Solidarity Working Group. I also serve as the North America coordinator for the BDS movement. And I'm so excited to be here with you all today and our incredible panelists that we have today. DSA is not a political party, though we do have some aspirations for the future, but we're a socialist organization that is big tent, meaning we don't subscribe to one particular school of socialism, but we're working to build a broad working class anti-capitalist movement. We have 241 chapters across the country. Omar Barghouti is a Palestinian human rights defender and co-founder of the Palestinian-led Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement for Palestinian Rights. He is a co-recipient of the 2017 Gandhi Peace Award. So my first question is for Omar. Can you tell everyone here, what is the BDS movement?
Thanks, Olivia, and I'm really honored to be with you, with the panelists and all the attendees. The Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, or BDS movement, was established by the absolute majority in Palestinian society, whether within Palestine or in exile. It is inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement and the US civil rights movement, among other liberation movements. It basically calls for basic Palestinian rights under international law, specifically ending Israel's military occupation, ending its system of institutionalized racial discrimination, which amounts to apartheid, as is increasingly being recognized now. And third, the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to the homes and lands from which they had been expelled, ethnically cleansed, since the 1948 Nakba onwards. So BDS calls for nonviolent pressure on Israel, as was done against South Africa, to end its regime of settler colonialism, military occupation, and apartheid, so that Palestinians can enjoy freedom, justice, and equality. BDS is an intersectional movement as well. It sees Palestinian liberation as part of the justice struggles around the world, not separate from them. We never believed that Palestinians can be liberated if every oppressed community around the world remains oppressed. So working with other oppressed communities for racial justice, gender justice, climate justice, social justice, economic justice is not something that we do just to get ahead and to feel more powerful. It's something principled. It's something we truly believe in, and it's something strategic as well. So it's both a matter of principle and a matter of strategy, because we do see our liberation as connected to those justice movements.
Thank you, Omar. And I think, yeah, you make a great point about how this is an intersectional struggle. And I think that brings us to our next question, which is how does the BDS movement relate to other important social movements in the US specifically, like the movement for Black Lives or the labor movement? And would love to hear specifically from Marc and Ajamu on this.
Yeah, well, I'll jump in really quick, and Ajamu can speak much more in sophisticated fashion about the labor movement in particular around this question. But first of all, thank you all for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, and I'm always honored to be with my comrades and my friends and my colleagues. This amazing panel is certainly no exception. I think part of it, as Omar said, is that this is partly about at the conceptual level, and understanding that our fates are bound up with one another. That at the analytical level, we understand that we can't dismantle white supremacy or imperialism section by section, that these systems don't have passports or visas, they don't stop at borders, that these are international, transnational movements. And so there's no way to stop a settler colonial movement in Palestine and not be mindful of its relationship to a settler colonial project in New Zealand or Australia or the United States. It also relates to the extent that we're literally engaged in intersectional struggles. I mean, one of the things that came up in the last few years with the movement for Black Lives was this question around police exchanges. Just as one example, right? That U.S. police are being trained, some police departments are being trained in Israel, and some Israeli police are being trained in the United States. It's very important to say now, it doesn't mean that U.S. repression was learned from Israel. Well, the U.S. has been a repressive state long before Israel. Israel didn't have to teach America how to be repressive or violent or engage or kill Black people, and vice versa. But there is something to be said about the rising authoritarianism, the expansion of a security state, the use of particular types of weaponry that we see both in Israel and the United States that speaks to a global system that we have to dismantle. The other piece here, I think, really quickly, is that the aspiration of many of these US-based social movements are international in scope. We no longer are just looking, when I talk to younger activists, I talk about when Rodney King was beaten in '91, we would have celebrated to simply have an arrest. At one point we wanted Black police chiefs. It's like we wanted to get beaten by Black cops. There was a way that we wanted to integrate police departments. We wanted police to have to live in our neighborhoods, but the freedom dream became more robust and more ambitious as time went on. And this generation of activists is saying, no, let's defund. No, let's abolish. Let's imagine new possibilities. And one of the new possibilities that they've imagined is a world where that is anti-imperialist, that they don't want to just nation build, but they want a world make. And so Black Lives Matter very explicitly is talking about the dismantling of a Zionist project, dismantling of a settler colonial project, and very explicitly embracing BDS on those grounds. So it's analytical, it's tied, our fates are tied up, but there's also a very clear political mission that I think is far more progressive or radical than we had even 20 years ago in the mainstream.
Before we move on, I want to remind you that Temple professor Marc Lamont Hill was fired from CNN as a commentator for stating the obvious about Palestine at a meeting in the United Nations. He had talked about aspiring for a country with equal rights for all, quote, from the river to the sea. 6 taboo words that ultra-rightists say is anti-Semitic.
In Burma, police fired water cannons on peaceful protesters in Rangoon as mass demonstrations continued today for the 3rd straight day, opposing the military coup that deposed the de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi 1 week ago.
We can't just let the military win. Citizens have already shown their demands by voting. We are on the street to show that we are against military dictatorship.
Burmese authorities shut down the internet for part of the weekend as fears mount of a harsh military crackdown on protesters. In India, farm workers blockaded roads across the country as they continue a historic mass protest against Prime Minister Narendra Modi's reforms that seek to deregulate agricultural markets. Tractors, trucks, and tents blocked traffic for several hours Saturday as the UN urged authorities to respect the right to peaceful assembly. In northern India, at least 14 people were confirmed dead and over 150 missing and feared dead after part of a glacier broke off in the Himalayas, triggering a flood of water, rock, and mud that collapsed a hydroelectric dam. Himalayan glaciers are rapidly melting due to global heating. Environmental groups have warned against building power projects in the area, which is vulnerable to landslides and flooding.
And the connection to climate change was not just from left-wing Democracy Now!, but also from corporate NBC News. It quoted Anjal Prakash, lead author of a 2 2018 UN Special Report on Climate, who said, "This looks very much like a climate change event as the glaciers are melting due to global warming." So climate change is not something for your grandchildren to worry about. Its beginnings are right now. This is a crucial moment in the fight against fracked gas. The Connecticut Legislature's Energy Committee is considering a bill to stop all construction of fossil fuel plants. It will decide by February 16th. It's not a Connecticut issue, it's a worldwide issue. Call 860-240-0430 and leave a tape message on why you oppose any more fossil fuel power plants. Talking about climate, we have to talk about Bitcoin. The price for a single Bitcoin jumped to $48,000 after Elon Musk bought $1.5 billion of them. The thing is, though, they are maintained electronically by many, many computers that are on 24/7. The BBC had a report that various kinds of cryptocurrency use the same amount of electrical energy in a year as does the country of Argentina. David Gerard, who has a book and a blog about crypto, said Tesla got $1.5 billion in environmental subsidies in 2020, funded by the taxpayer. It turned around and spent $1.5 billion on Bitcoin, which is mostly mined with electricity made from coal. Their subsidy needs to be examined. Now to more from the speakers at the recent Connecticut Climate Crisis Mobilization Zoom panel.
All right, next up we have Rob Wallace from the University of Minnesota. He's the author of several academic papers on evolutionary epidemiology, as well as the author of the phenomenal book, Big Farms Make Big Flu, Dispatches on Infection, Disease, Agribusiness, and the Nature of Science. It was published in 2016. So I'm very excited to hear you speak, Rob. Go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. I'm calling from the Minnesota here, St. Paul. I've been here for a few years, but I'm originally a New Yorker, so I also would like to talk fast, but I'm going to try to keep it slow so the translation can work out and stuff. So I'm going to stick to my notes too. So many of the interventions proposed from left to right these days at best align with the notion that we can fix capitalism. But capitalism, which is the privatizing the fruits of working people's labor, is the problem. So to be unfair, I'm going to be unfair here. It's like we can fix capitalism. That's like saying we can fix slavery. So let's give the slaves the weekend off or a tax cut. And indeed, during the antebellum period, there were so-called progressive slaveholders who wanted to slow down the pace at which Black lives were turned into cotton and to produce a more ecological plantation. But capitalism is the problem, and it's a system that presumes infinite economic growth on a finite planet. It aims to commoditize everything, including nature and the people who live there, meaning all of us. And in doing so, it produces the worst of social and ecological problems that until now, it could push off onto the powerless. There's no clearer marker of that divide this past year than the Black and brown workers taking the subway to work, and as Greg described, getting sick so that the professional managerial class could stay home, where they get to pat themselves on the back of being such good citizens during a pandemic. On the global scale, the global South was and remains both the global North's refrigerator and its toilet. The North takes the South's resources and leaves behind the worst of environmental and social damage to the tune of millions of dead people a year. But now problems are turning into what are called hyper objects, problems that are everywhere all at once. These aren't just being dumped on the global south. The wealthiest might be able to hide from them for a while, but no one, by definition, will be able to outrun climate change and pandemics. Now, is there a way out? Yes, as mentioned, a Green New Deal is one possibility, but which Green New Deal? The non-binding Green New Deal that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey proposed is threaded through with some of the right rhetoric. But against the kind of Anglo-American habit for getting drunk upon the slug of the weakest political liquor, Max Idle, in his new book, schools us that there are many more Green New Deals out there. So you have the EU's new Green New Deal, you have degrowth and Green New Deal, you have green social control, you have Bernie Sanders' version of it, you have technocratic Green New Deals, you have the Cochabamba version of it, you have the reformists, you have the eco-socialist one, you have Michael Bloomberg's, you have the Malthusian one, you have the Red Deal coming out of the indigenous groups, you have the eco-modernist version, you have the planetary Green New Deal, you have Fortress Green New Deal. And some of these are obviously better than others. I mean, you don't look to Jeff Bezos for your climate solution unless you plan on buying canisters of air from Amazon a decade from now, right? So that's ironic, of course, right? Given that the real Amazon, the forests we're losing, gives us our oxygen for nearly free. But one you'd ask whether some of the progressive New Deals out there are just another version of Fortress Green New Deal, fortressing the global north against the oncoming disaster, largely of its own making. Now, there's certainly room for what are called transitional demands that can start us off on our way, but they shouldn't be our final destination. We need to dream bigger than that. The answer here and elsewhere is liberation. We need to move away from commoditizing everything and reintegrate humanity back into Earth's natural economy. We must shift our mode of social reproduction toward a regimen of degrowth, decolonization, developmental convergence between global north and south, debt cancellation, and disalienation of land and labor. Now that goes for solving COVID and climate alike. The two problems, as Justin raised, are both intertwined in their origins and their resolution. And as Elizabeth described, rural economies, for instance, are organized around agribusiness production. Farmers are largely paid only if they engage in the kinds of destructive agricultural practices that end up selecting for the deadliest of infectious diseases and stripping landscapes of the ecosystem services any climate adaptation will require. Industrializing animal production also industrializes the pathogens that circulate among them. And there's a large body of research that shows that the larger the livestock herd or the poultry flock and the lesser the genetic diversity of the animals produced, the deadlier and more infectious the pathogens that evolve and potentially can spill over into humans. The more land agribusiness forces into production, depressing commodity prices and forcing farmers to grow crops and livestock as far out as onto the rough river buffers, the weaker the soils that are needed, that we need for carbon drawdown, and the more prone the landscape is to flooding. So introducing agricultural biodiversity on farm and across rural counties will help box out the deadly pathogens that would now be unable to string together a bunch of accessible hosts, one after the other, to be infected. That very biodiversity also helps build the soils for carbon drawdown and flood control. Now, such a switch in agricultural regime depends upon returning decision-making power back to rural communities. Agribusinesses, largely headquartered in suburban areas, treat rural communities as sacrifice zones to be carbon mined for profit. The resulting damage to the people and who live there, the resulting damage to land and people is dumped upon local communities. So returning community control to the people who live there can help resurrect the town economies that keep profits circulating within the counties. They're not just stripped of their money. If they're not stripped with their money, then there's less fascination with fascist politics, right? We want to undercut that dynamic. So such a switcheroo produces the economic room for agricultural practices that along the way bring a better sense of well-being, control animal diseases that have been shown to go pandemic, and produce landscapes adapted to climate change, all at once. Liberation isn't just a utopian ideal. It's a source of solving our everyday problems in pragmatic ways. It's something that we need both urban and rural groups to work together on, the kind of people power that Jeremy brought up, both within the United States and across the global North, global South divide. Many of the best new practices in scaling up the agroecology to solve climate change and pandemics is being conducted in the global South. So maybe we need to start listening to them and taking notes about what to do next. So a political platform for the 21st century in which internationalization defeats globalization. That's the path forward as I see it. And I'd love to hear what you guys think about it. All right, thank you very much.
My farm was one of the very first community-supported agriculture farms in the country, and I wrote Sharing the Harvest based on my experience. I started farming in 1979, the year when thousands of tractors rode to Washington, D.C. to protest the end of parity. It was a farm crisis that's been going on really throughout the time that I have been farming. The number of farms has dropped precipitously, and the size of the farms keeps on increasing while we lose land altogether from farming. It's been especially severe for African American farmers who've lost almost all of their farmland. Altogether, farmers' share of the food dollar has been shrinking. The agribusinesses that are increasingly consolidated are buying up the smaller businesses. And the effect of that is that the prices that are paid by consumers go up, whereas the price that farmers get hardly move at all. So here you see the effect on bread. The upper line, the orange line, is bread sold in a food store. And down below, the very slight increase in the blue line is the amount of money that the farmers got who grew the wheat. And we see that same pattern in raw products. So here you see broccoli rising in price in the store, and the farmers sometimes getting more, sometimes less. So the real net income altogether of farmers has gone up and down, but if you look at the most recent years, it has been going dramatically down. Most farmers make most of their living off the farm, not on the farm. And if you look at high value crops, a small part of the farm living actually comes from things like organic vegetables or direct sales, farmers markets. But if you look at general livestock, those farms are actually losing money, and it's the rest of the family that keeps the farm going, covering the farmer's farming habit. So this is a very interesting chart that was created by a farmer named Brad Wilson, who's been working for farmer justice since the late 70s. The blue represents the subsidy that the actual payment that farmers get in the marketplace. The orange is the subsidies that farmers get from the government. And these days, what farmers get has been a huge transfer of wealth from the farmers to the biggest corporations. So the subsidies make up a very small portion of what the farmers were actually getting paid during the parity years, where you see the blue. Structural racism very much determines what goes on in the food system. The jobs that have the lowest pay go to people of color and women. And so many of the people who work in the food system, farm workers and other workers, get public assistance because they're not being paid enough to cover buying their own food. So my farm is one of many community-supported agriculture and organic farms in the Northeast. In Connecticut, you have the Connecticut Northeast Organic Farming Association, which I recommend to you highly. NOFA as a whole has been in existence for 50 years, and it's an association of farmers and conscious eaters, and we have been building an alternative food system for these 50 years. My farm, Peacework, was a CSA. We did vegetables. But more than just growing vegetables, we had a really cooperative enterprise through which all the members of the CSA, here you see members of the core group signing up other members, and here members coming out to the farm to help with the harvest. Everybody chipped in. Our farms, the organic farms of the small-scale farms, are extremely diverse. And I'd like to just remind you of a little science. Do you remember photosynthesis? If anyone tries to tempt you with investing $1 billion in some new machine to take carbon out of the air and put it in the ground, we already have that, and it's free. It's photosynthesis, which takes carbon dioxide and energy from the sun and water and puts it in the soil. Plants extrude about 30% or more of the glucose that they create. They're not leaky, they're trading. They're trading this glucose for the nutrients that the plants need. It's a beautiful system that's evolved over millions of years. So keep in mind photosynthesis and the biology, the microbiology that's going on there, and that reflects our own microbiome. If you have healthy soil, your body is going to be more healthy as well. So here's one of my farmer friends, Jay Armour. He produces a lot of compost. That's a way of recycling nutrients and also increasing the amount of carbon that soil can build up and sequester. So farms like Four Winds Farm, this is a farm in Missouri where you hardly see any tillage at all. And the ground in most of the places is covered. There's something growing all the time because that growth is taking carbon out of the air and feeding the microbiology. Here's a farm in New York State that's doing the same thing. This is no-till organic. And finally, a very beautiful farm in Massachusetts. The Green New Deal that was called forth by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Markey is not actually a set program. It's an outline, and it's been a tremendous opening for making the changes that we haven't been able to make for 50 years, really. What we need is a parity system, and we can learn from the parity system that is one of the previous speakers mentioned during the 30s was not at all fair to African-American farmers and contributed to them losing their land. But it did save many white farms, and it put the payments that farmers got in balance with the rest of the economy and allowed grains to be stored so that when the price was too low, farmers didn't have to sell. And if the price got too high, farmers could release grains back into the market and lower the price so that consumers didn't have to pay too much. And it was a possibility for bringing livestock into family farms. And because participation in parity was connected to supply management and conservation practices, it ended the Dust Bowl. So we need Agrarian justice for the 21st century. Parity prices. It will end oversupply. It will end food waste. We need farmer-owned processing for value-added products. We need living wages for everybody in the food system, farmers, farm workers, restaurant workers, everybody, and access to everybody for healthy, locally grown, fresh, and culturally appropriate food, and community control through cooperatives, faith-based initiatives, and community organizations. We need to also continue to maintain the organic label, because it's the organic farms who have refused to use synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So even if their organic practices are not everything that we would hope for, just by being organic, they are using 30% less energy than the conventional farms, because that is what is caused by producing synthetic nitrogen fertilizer and delivering it and using it on the farms. So I will end with this. We need to keep the soil inorganic, have genuine family scale organic farms, agroecology for food sovereignty, so that we will be part of the international movement that's trying to break the grip of the corporations that have brought us climate change, and working together, we can make enormous changes on our planet. Thank you.
That's our program for today, folks. Stay safe, but stay active. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.